Hello, thanks for joining me. With this lecture, we're going to start a new section in this course, the Age of Empires. So far, we've had lectures about key thinkers in India and China at the beginning of those two traditions, right at the Darshana Hotel and then the Tao Hotel in China. And mostly those have been in the historical context of competing regional kingdoms, in both locations. But now, it's like the hotels are under new management. They've been taken over by maybe a very large multinational corporations, or to get back to the historical situation, what happens is powerful, unified, highly centralized regimes are taking hold in India and in China. And these are our empires that are going to hold sway over many different ethnicities and languages. By the end of this lecture, we'll see the emergence of a universal empire in China. That's the Han Dynasty that lasts about 400 years, from 200 BC to about 220 AD. It's contemporary with the Roman Empire on the other side of the Eurasian landmass. It has about the same size of territory, about the same number of people. It's fairly comparable. It's not the first of these universal empires. That would be the Persian Empire, and then followed by Alexander's empire, and then the Mauryan Empire in India. But we're going to keep the story going in China before we go back and then backtrack to pick up some of those other stories. Okay. All of these universal empires have some basic similarities. I suppose because when you're governing over very large territories, large populations, there are some administrative techniques that basically have to be in place. So they divide the territory into smaller administrative units. Provinces in the Roman Empire, satrapies in the Persian Empire, commanderies they're called in the Chinese Empire. These are more centralized than, say, the United States. It would be as if the governor of each of the 50 states was appointed by the president. There are law codes in these empires. There's an ideology that gives some justification for why the people in charge are ruling. There's an elaborate bureaucracy. There are records that have to be kept. There's oftentimes a new title for the ruler, right? Before there were kings in all these small kingdoms, but now there's a ruler who is the king of kings, is what he's called in Persia, or the emperor in China. They usually build an impressive capital that intimidates visitors from afar. There's propaganda, there's a common language so that people serving in the army can understand commands, even though they come from different areas, regions, and linguistic families. There are also more trade that happens that often uses a lingua franca. There are good roads, standardized weights and measures and coinage, oftentimes tolerance for local beliefs and customs. Okay. All of this is pretty practical. In China, how do we get from the Warring States era, the time of the 100 schools, to the single unified empire? The answer is going to lie with military strategists and legalists. And legalism is the third great native philosophy of China, along with Confucianism and Taoism. Let me start with a story from Sima Qian. Seems like I mention him about every lecture. This is about Zhang Liang, one of the great generals of the day, about 200 BC. When Zhang Liang was young, he met an old man on an embankment. And the man was wearing sort of rough clothes, wasn't that impressive, and he threw a shoe down the embankment, and he said, "Go fetch that for me." Zhang Liang was sort of taken back by that, but he scrambled down, got the shoe, and brought it up, and the old man then held out his foot and said, "Put it on for me." Zhang Liang was actually angry at being treated this way, but he did put it on the old man. The old man started to walk away, and then he turns around and he says, "You can be taught, young man. Why don't you meet me here in 5 days at dawn?" Okay, so 5 days, Zhang Liang was just curious. 5 days later, he shows up about sunrise. The old man's there who says, "Why are you late? Like, I'll give you another chance. Come back 5 days from now, but don't be late." So 5 days later, Zhang Liang went even before light. The old man was already there. Once again, "Why are you late? One last chance, 5 days from now." So 5 days later, Zhang Liang gets up about midnight and goes over to this place. The old man isn't there. He waits for a while. Finally, the old man shows up and he says, "This is the way things ought to be." And then he gives Zhang Liang a book. And he says, "Read this and you will be a teacher of kings." And then he disappeared, never heard from again. And it turned out that this book was a secret handbook of military strategy called The Grand Duke's Art of War. Okay, doesn't this sound like every kung fu movie you've ever seen? Wouldn't you like to know what was in that book? I actually would like to know too, but it was so secret it was lost. And perhaps it was just a legendary explanation for Zhang Yang's uncanny abilities on the battlefield. But fortunately, there's another text, not so secret, that we still have, called The Art of War by Sunzi. Okay, this is going to be a tricky name here. In the last lecture, we talked about Sunzi, the Confucian philosopher, and this is Sunzi. The characters are different, the tones are different. Actually, the sounds are different. That's why there's an X, is this sort of SH sound. But I will try to help you keep this straight. In this lecture, we'll be talking about Master Sun, Sunzi, the military strategist. According to tradition, there were actually two strategists named Sun, both from the same family line, and they both wrote books called The Art of War. So both of them are called Master Sunzi, and so even the Chinese sometimes confuse them. But Sun Wu, who was the ancestor of the two, was supposed to have lived at the time of Confucius. But his book, and that's the one that's most familiar today, That Art of War, probably was written maybe in the 4th century BC, in the Warring States era. The work of the descendant, Sun Bin, was lost centuries ago until ancient versions of both books were discovered in an archaeological excavation in 1972. Sun Bin was said to have had his feet cut off as a punishment on a trumped-up charge brought by a rival. So he couldn't even walk to the battlefield, but he could control it like a chess game from afar. Warfare was changing from aristocrats who were fighting one-on-one from chariots, like in the Iliad or in the Mahabharata in India. So, this is aristocratic virtue, so they want to fight fairly. You don't want to attack your enemy until he's ready. Now they're losing that, and they're going to massive armies, sometimes thousands, tens of thousands of men on the battlefield. And these are made up of peasant conscripts. The older book, the older Art of War, is more abstract, while the newer one is based on specific battles, but both of them have the same sorts of principles. So according to the Art of War, warfare is based on deception. A skilled general gives the impression that he's strong when he's actually weak, and that he's weak when he's actually strong, and that he's far away when he's quite near. He always hides his true intentions from his foes, and he acts in surprising, unorthodox ways. A good general will take advantage of the weather and of the terrain. They use the term sure, that means translated as situational power. It's sort of like a rock sitting at the top of a mountain. There's a lot of potential energy there for the person who can perceive that that's there. So there might be in an unusual kind of terrain to fight on. A good general attacks when the enemy is weak, and he avoids battle when the enemy is strong. And protracted warfare that just goes on and on, that is always a mistake. The very best victories are those that expend the least resources. Without fighting at all, if possible. So you should keep destruction to a minimum. It doesn't do you a lot of good to take over a territory that's been devastated. Everything's been burned and torn apart. You can use spies and secret agents and manipulative diplomacy, and those can be almost as important as the number of soldiers that you have. So the principles espoused in this text seem like Taoism in some ways. There's reversal, there's paradoxes, right? Pretend to be weak when you're strong, or strong when you're weak. They're following the natural flow of territory and of weather patterns, and it's against conventional wisdom, conventional morality sometimes. Let me give you some examples of things that sound almost Taoist from the Art of War. The position of troops can be likened to water. Just as the water avoids high ground and rushes to the lowest point, so on the path to victory, avoid the enemy's strong points and strike where he's weak. Another quotation, as water shapes its flow in accordance with the ground, so an army manages its victory in accordance with the situation of the enemy. Remember how important the image of water was in the Lao Tzu, in the Tao Te Ching. One more. Water has no constant dynamic. Water has no constant form. The art of warfare, that's Sun Wu's ancient art of warfare, was studied by generals throughout Chinese history and was important in Mao Zedong's successes against the Japanese in World War II and then the nationalists under Chiang Kai-shek shortly thereafter. The book is still read in military academies in China and in Japan and in the United States, and it's lately been adapted for use in the world of business. Okay. There's several of these titles, but one that I like particularly is Mark McNeely's Sunzi and the Art of Business. And he spells Sunzi in that old way, so it's S-U-N-T-Z-U instead of the Z-I at the end. And the chapters tend to follow Sunzi's Art of War. So they have titles like Win All Without Fighting, Capturing Your Market Without Destroying It. Avoid Strength and Attack Weakness, Striking Where They Least Expect It. Deception and Foreknowledge, Maximizing the Power of Market Information. And then finally, Speed and Preparation, Moving swiftly to overcome your competitors. But what will eventually make a difference in the quest to create an empire, we're back in the ancient world now, is not just winning individual battles, but organizing entire countries for war. And that's the contribution of legalism, a philosophy that's closely associated with the rise of the state of Qin, and that's Q-I-N, Qin, which in 221 BC united all of China under the first emperor. Actually, the word Qin is where we get our word China from. Chinese call their own country Zhongguo, that means the Middle Kingdom or the Central States. Traditionally, when I talk about legalism, that should be your cue to boo and hiss, because these are the bad guys of Chinese philosophy. But they were remarkably effective. The basic idea of legalism is that people can be made to do about anything through rewards and punishments. Now, most rulers have somewhat questionable ambitions for power and for glory, and they can use legalist tactics to make their people serve them in those ways. Moralists like Confucius and Mozi, they said, are hopelessly idealistic. What's realistic is that human nature is evil. Sort of sounds like Sunzi, right? The philosopher from the last lecture. But at least it's selfish, it's self-centered. The legalists are not a unified school, but they're rather thinkers who shared an interest in strengthening the power of the state through rational, practical means. I mean, sometimes they're compared with 20th century totalitarians, or one modern commentator has referred to the movement as being devoted to the amoral science of statecraft. So they rejected the ways of the past, including traditional forms of morality and culture and aristocracy, and instead they advocated for new laws, for new administrative policies, and new methods of personal management. As states grew larger and more powerful, there was an increased need for organization and centralization. But frequently, what the rulers really wanted was to make their states more successful in war. So legalists recommended the use of laws, along with punishments and rewards, as the best way to motivate people. Now, this isn't laws set up as for rule of law, something that even rulers have to submit to. It works the other way. I mean, law is a tool for rulers to use. It's instrumental. And ideally, laws should be objective, comprehensive, universal, harsh, and public. Okay, let me go through that list again a little more slowly. They should be objective. So if you want your people to fight hard in battle, let's say you offer them a piece of gold for every head that they bring in, an enemy head that they bring in. The nice thing about that is there isn't a lot of arguing. You can count, right? 2 heads, 2 pieces of gold. It's very simple. Kind of grisly, I suppose. Also, the law should be comprehensive. It should include both good and bad things. So we're going to punish people for running away in battle, and we're going to reward people for successfully killing enemies. It should be universal. It applies to everyone equally. So it doesn't matter if your father was a shoemaker or your father was a great general. Everyone gets the same reward. A head, a piece of gold. Actually, heads are kind of gruesome. They ended up using ears. And it has to be a left ear. You can't get 2 for 1 in this case. So quantifiable standards, if at all possible. We're to our 4th standard. It should be harsh. So if you give gold for killing the enemy, for running away in battle, it should be execution. We'll kill people who are cowards in battle. And finally, the law should be public. Everyone should know exactly what's expected of them, punishments and rewards, and then they'll act in accordance with that. So legalists taught that the government should promote agriculture, because that's important for feeding large armies out in the field. And they should discourage unproductive activities such as trade or scholarship, the manufacture of luxury goods. They also argued that the king should rule over the peasants directly rather than through local aristocrats or hereditary landowners. Actually, let me just return to one point quickly here, and that's this idea of trade. In ancient China, it was different from in our modern world when we know how important business and trade is for the economy, for the growth of the economy. Back then, they thought that merchants were sort of suspect because they bought at low prices and sold at high prices, and their profits were directly correlated with inaccessibility to goods or to people's ignorance as to how much things were actually worth. So they tended to think of merchants as parasites. They're just making money off of other people's efforts. Better to get rid of that class and have people just producing through agriculture. All right, somewhat surprisingly, legalism, like the military theories of Sunzi, was oftentimes associated with Taoism. I mean, it seems strange that an assertive, aggressive philosophy might be connected to something that talks about non-action. But the idea was that legalist philosophers would go to a ruler and say, let me set up the laws in the country, and I can make people do things with rewards and punishments, and that will free up you to just do nothing, non-action in your palace where you can enjoy wine, women, song, whatever it is that your heart desires. So here's actually a quotation from a man named Feizi. He says, speaking to a ruler, "Do not let your power be seen, be blank and actionless. The sage holds to the source and lets the four quarters come to serve him. In emptiness he awaits them, and they spontaneously do what is needed." That's sort of a nice introduction for our second great mind of this lecture, who is none other than Feizi, the person who I just quoted. Feizi lived from about 280 to 233 BC, and he represents the epitome of legalist thought. He was from an aristocratic family, which was rather unusual for the wandering debaters at the time, and he was a student of the Confucian philosopher Sunzi. Because of a speech defect, Feizi was forced to put his ideas into essays, to write them down. He couldn't really hold forth orally in front of a ruler. His own ruler, unfortunately, wasn't much interested in these writings, but they caught the attention of the king of Qin. And when his country was taken over by Qin, this is the Han's country, which is also the country of Han, he was sent as an envoy, maybe like a gift, actually, to the king of Qin. There was a prime minister in the state of Qin who was one of his fellow students long before he knew Feizi, and he didn't want him around as a rival, so he accused him of basically treason. He said to the first emperor, "This guy's always going to be looking after his own state's interests. He's not really going to be serving you." And he manages to get him killed. This minister, Li Si, will someday himself be similarly executed on a trumped-up charge. These are very deadly games, intrigues that these men are playing. In the book, The Feizi, again, the book's title is the same as the author, we see several themes. Let me give you 4 of them, sort of advice for government. First, punishments and rewards are the 2 handles of government. So you think about it as a plow that you can move one way or the other, holding on by 2 handles. He says rulers should hold these powers tightly, rewards and punishment. If he allows the ministers, his ministers, to give out rewards or punishments, then people will try to please the ministers instead of himself. Second theme, there are 3 components to effective rule: law, situational power, which we talked about before, remember the rock on the top of the cliff, and methods, specifically methods of controlling the bureaucracy. Rulers should, we're to the 3rd theme now, rulers need to keep a careful eye on their ministers, carefully assign them responsibilities and then hold them accountable. Sometimes ministers who do too much can be as dangerous as those who do too little. If good things happen, the ruler should take credit for all the accomplishments. If bad things happen, he should blame it on his subordinates. There's something kind of Machiavellian about this. 4th theme from Feizi, the ideal ruler should be transcendent and mysterious, like a Taoist sage. So the state should be able to continue even with a weak ruler, because because men of talent are somewhat rare, even in royal families. And a ruler should hide his true desires and emotions in order to protect himself from flattery. I mean, people know what he wants to have happen. They'll tell him what he wants to hear. Feizi gives arguments for some of these ideas. For example, he says, imagine that there's a bad young man. He's getting into all kinds of trouble, and his parents try to deal with him, and his neighbors talk to him, and the teachers try to do an intervention, and they all fail. But if the magistrate sends out soldiers ready to arrest him, that young man is going to change his ways. So the best punishments are those that are severe and inescapable. And he gives an example of a famous villain in Chinese history named Robber Zhi. And he says, actually, there's a way to make it so that Robber Zhi, even he, wouldn't reach out and pick up some gold that was on the ground, even if it was right there within reach. And that is, if the gold were molten, if it were like in liquid form that hot, even Robber Zhi wouldn't touch it because he'd know he'd be burned. That's what punishments should be like. They should be absolutely inescapable and immediate. And then you can motivate people. Feizi says that farming is hard and literature is easy by comparison. So if the ruler rewards literary scholars, then people are going to quit farming and they're going to go to school and they're all going to start writing books, and the state's going to be impoverished because there aren't going to be people doing agriculture now. He tells a story, a famous story, about a man from the state of Song who sat on a stump one day, and as he was sitting there, a rabbit came running through and hit the stump and broke his neck and fell over dead. And then the man picked up the rabbit, went home, had some rabbit stew. He said, this is great. And he quit farming and then sat on a stump waiting for a rabbit to come by again. Okay. He became a laughingstock, of course, because things that worked in the past don't necessarily work now. Precedent doesn't help out. You need to focus on what's actually effective. Don't waste time on literature and on trade. Just focus on agriculture and what's going to work now. Actually, that story gets to be one of those chengyu. Do you remember those 4-character phrases? Shouju, daitu, to sit on a stump and wait for a rabbit to come by again. As part of the Feizi, there's a chapter called the Essay on 5 Vermin. So these are people that Feizi thinks are dangerous. Scholars spouting their own morals, conniving advisors of uncertain loyalty. These are those itinerant debaters from the 100 schools. Private swordsmen, bribing draft dodgers, and merchants peddling useless luxury items. Okay. Time for a quick review here. Since we're going to leave China for the next 4 lectures, let's make sure you've got things down. We're going to compare legalism with some other schools. Compared to the Confucians, there is some contrast, right? Confucians like the influence of parents and neighbors and teachers. Legalists say that's not enough. You can't count on moral rulers setting an example, and precedent doesn't matter. Don't look to what had worked in the past. Do what works now. But they do agree with at least some Confucians, Sunzi, that people are self-interested and they care about the rectification of names, of making titles match up with responsibilities. When we compare the legalists to the Moists, remember the ones who care about impartial caring, legalists are not religious and they don't care about morality, but they do care about authority and mobilizing society and utilitarian ends and uniform standards. They share all that with Moists. When we compare them to the Taoists, legalists are competitive and aggressive. That doesn't seem like the Taoists. But they also value inaction, at least for the ruler, and laws should follow nature if at all possible. Now, the grand question. In a contest between a Confucian state and a Taoist state and a legalist state, who's going to win? And the answer might be obvious. Okay, legalists are going to win. But that's only sort of true. The state of Qin took over all of China in 221 BC, and the first emperor's success was in due part to his adoption of legalist techniques of governing. Qin was a newer state on the borders of the Chinese cultural region. There were fewer entrenched traditions and fewer aristocrats, and so he was able to remake it according to new laws. This is the same guy who built a tomb for himself with the terracotta soldiers near Xi'an that some of you may have visited. He built the fortifications that will eventually become the Great Wall, and he takes a new title. He calls himself Shi Huangdi, which means emperor, but he makes this up. We'll just call him the first emperor. And he divides China into 36 commanderies. He standardizes the weights and the measures and the laws. He standardizes axle widths so that the same roads can be used everywhere. He standardizes the script. Before this time, Chinese was written in different ways in different places. But now he says, we're all going to write it the same way. And the way that Chinese is written today goes back to the reforms of the first emperor. But he's not interested in tolerance. Legalism says all of that scholarship is a bunch of nonsense. So the first emperor says, I want history to start with me. We're going to get rid of all literature and all history. We're going to get rid of all books, except for those that are very practical. Medicine, divination, maybe agriculture manuals. So he managed to bring all China together, but his dynasty only lasts for 14 years, and then it collapses. What happened? For one thing, it looks like there was too much concentration of power, too much power at the top. So once the first emperor had gained all of China, his next goal was to live as long as possible, to live forever if he possibly could. And he got advice from experts who would come in. Some of them said, you should live like a Taoist. You should sort of be hidden in your palace. If people see you, they'll think, oh, he's just a guy. We could take him on. But if you're this mysterious presence, they will give you more reverence. This is sort of like the Wizard of Oz theory of government, right? Don't pay attention to the man behind the curtain. The great and powerful first emperor, in this case, is in control of everything. Now, he was open to that because there had been several assassination attempts on his life already, including Zhang Liang. Do you remember the guy who got the secret book from the guy who threw his shoe down the embankment? Okay. If you've seen the movie Hero, which is Zhang Yimou's 2002 movie, that's about an assassination attempt on the first emperor. So he's hidden away, but he has some advisors coming in who say, we can give you this secret to immortality, the elixir that will make you live forever, but we need some money for research. So he would give him some money, they'd bring in something, he'd try it out, and it wouldn't work, he'd kill them, but somebody else would come. Finally, there was a group that said, we are so close to coming up with this, but the secret ingredient is on an island offshore, and the island floats around, so it's a little hard to get to, and there's also a big sea monster guarding it. And the first emperor is a real take charge kind of guy. So he says, well, let's go down there and see what's happening. He goes down there, shoots some sort of big fish or something like that, and then suddenly he dies. Now, when he died, he was in a special imperial carriage that no one saw him except for his chief eunuch and his prime minister. And those two men, when they found the first emperor was dead, they said to each other, wow, he's dead, and we're the only two people who know about it. And the heir apparent is somebody who we can't really work with. Let's just pretend that the first emperor is alive, and we'll forge some orders. So food kept coming into the imperial carriage, kept coming out. Apparently he'd lost his appetite. Some orders kept coming out. One to the heir apparent, a suicide order. The young man got this, killed himself. It's sort of a tough family. Another order to put a younger brother, who's somebody that these two guys thought they could manipulate on the throne. But in order to make this happen, they had to get back to the capital as soon as they could. A strange, unpleasant odor started to come from the imperial carriage. They put a cartload of salted fish behind it to cover this up. They get back to the capital. They manage to make this work, but they've got somebody on the throne who's not very capable, and things start to fall apart pretty quickly. Another problem that they have is that it's too harsh. There's rebellions that start all over the place, the most famous of which is a man named Chansha. He is required, with other people from his village, other men, to go to a work detail to build a road a couple 100 miles away. And so they start on this journey to go there, and then they get behind schedule, some rain comes in, washes out some roads, and then there comes that magic moment when they look at the map to see how far they've got left, they look at the calendar, they see that they're behind, and they know that to arrive late for a work detail means execution. You're going to get killed. And they look at each other and say, what the heck? We're going to die anyways. So they revolt. All over China, there are these revolts that happen. Messages start coming to the emperor, this is the second emperor now, who says, how could there possibly be a revolt? My father set up everything perfectly. You must be lying. And he kills the messengers that come. The messengers quit coming with messages of revolt until it's too late, until the rebels are actually right there, and the second emperor is going to die, and things are going to collapse, and the eunuch who is behind this is going to die as well. And almost immediately, China is going to go into a civil war between some of the old aristocratic families and actually a guy named Liu Bang, who's going to win this 4-year civil war and going to found the Han Dynasty. Liu Bang is one of only 2 men in Chinese history who goes all the way from being a peasant to an emperor. When he comes to power, he promises people that the days of legalism are over, that he's going to run China with a law code of only 10 Chinese characters. It basically says murderers will be executed and those who injure or steal will be punished appropriately. Okay, you can't really run an empire on a 2-sentence law code. So what happens is when he comes in, he actually keeps a lot of the legalist administrative and tactics and government structures and laws. It's a little bit like what happens in the Roman Empire. When Caesar Augustus comes to power, he promises to restore the Senate and the old ways of doing things, but basically he's brought in a monarchy. So Liu Bang promises to get rid of legalism, but he pretty much continues what's been going on before. He combines the legalist government structure with Confucian ideology. Actually, not Liu Bang, but a successor later on does that pretty quickly. And that's a very powerful combination. You've got these very practical, realistic ways of governing people, of motivating people, along with a layer of thought about concern for the common people and about acting in moral ways. And that combination of legalism and Confucianism is very powerful. It proved to be a solid foundation for stable, lasting government in China, not just for the 400 years of the Han Dynasty, but throughout imperial China into the 20th century.